What if the most damning thing ever said about you was not something you did, but something you never had the chance to deny? In a small corner of Maine, buried beneath unmarked soil and forgotten ledgers, lies the story of Emeline Gurney, a woman born into poverty, remembered for a sin she never committed. They say she was his mother and his wife. They say she died alone, shamed and starving. But what if the truth is more cruel than the legend? This isn't just a tale of 19th century superstition or New England gossip. It's a story about how the world punishes poor women, about how a life of quiet suffering can be twisted into tragedy, then immortalized as scandal. And once a woman becomes a symbol, no amount of truth can save her. Her name was Emeline. She walked the dirt roads of Fayette. She raised a son, buried 2 husbands, and endured the cold silence of a town that claimed to know her shame. And when she died, her story didn't die with her. It only grew darker. This is not a story about incest. It's a story about what happens when a lie is more seductive than the truth, and how one woman became America's oldest, most haunting myth. Fayette, Maine, 1816. A world of frostbitten mornings, broken soil, and threadbare families living one season at a time. It was here, in a wooden home clinging to the edge of survival, that Emeline Bachelder was born. The 4th child of a farmer with too little land and too many mouths to feed. She didn't grow up with comfort. She grew up with absence, of heat, of shoes, of choices. While the legend imagines her young and beautiful, sent to Massachusetts mills at 14, there is no record of that journey, no factory, no seduction, no secret child. Emeline never left Maine. Instead, she was passed between homes like a parcel, a pauper, sustained by the charity of others in exchange for labor. She scrubbed floors, watched children, worked without pay. Her youth was not stolen by scandal, but by survival. At 27, she married George Chamberlain, a widower with children of his own. They had a son together, Gustavus, a boy born into poverty but kept close, raised beside his mother in the cold wood frame house of her own childhood. George abandoned them. No divorce, no closure, just disappearance. Years later, long after Gustavus had grown and left, Emeline married again. Leonard Gurney, an elderly widower from a neighboring town. There was no romance, no scandal, just 2 aging souls stitching together the remnants of their lives. The truth of her death is as quiet as her life. She died at 81 from dysentery. Not starvation, not exile. She simply grew old and sick and slipped away, leaving no will, no grave marker, and no heirs to defend her name. But something happened after her body turned cold. A story, born not from records, but from whispers, began to take shape. That she'd unknowingly married her own son. That her child, once given away, had returned as a stranger and become her husband. It wasn't true, but it didn't have to be, because the myth was more powerful than the woman. And in the silence she left behind, the town found its voice. Long after Emeline Gurney was gone, after the last of her kin had passed, and her name had faded from town records, a voice remained. Her name was Nettie Mitchell. Born a decade before Emeline's death, she claimed to have seen the old woman once, a shadowy figure, bent and alone, walking the road near Moose Hill. But what Nettie would remember most wasn't Emeline's face. It was the story. Passed from mother to daughter, whispered in kitchens and porches. It grew like frost on glass, intricate, cold, and impossible to ignore. According to Nettie, Emeline had been sent away at 14 to Lowell, Massachusetts, a mill girl with nothing but beauty and desperation. There, she was seduced by the son of a factory owner. When the child came, she was hidden, helped by a sympathetic couple who adopted the baby and sent her home with coin and silence. Years passed, then decades. Emeline, still unmarried, met a road worker from out of town. He was younger, strong, kind. They married quickly. But when his parents visited, the ones who had adopted a child so long ago, they recognized her, the woman who'd given them their son. The marriage was annulled. Her husband fled, and Foyet turned its back on the woman it claimed to know. She lived alone, they said, raised chickens, tended potatoes, and endured a winter so cruel that when the snow finally melted, they found her starved to death beside her empty stove. At her funeral, the town gathered, but not to mourn. One of her sisters, standing beside the plain pine coffin, raised her hand and said, "She has paid for her sin." A myth, complete, but no court record names the child, no birth certificate, no adoption, no marriage to a younger man. The tale rests on the memory of one woman, recounted a century later, filmed by a passing documentarian who believed he had found a story too strange to ignore. And he had. Because the myth of Emeline, the pauper girl turned mother bride, spread like wildfire, into books, into film, onto opera stages. It didn't matter that none of it was true. What mattered was how it made people feel. Ashamed, morbidly fascinated, righteous. And in that space between fact and fable, Emeline Gurney stopped being a person. She became a warning. Truth has no voice in a whisper, but it leaves footprints in ink, in census forms, in brittle paper buried in town archives. And those records speak louder than legends. The myth says Emeline was sent to Lowell to work in the mills, yet no travel record places her there. No factory log bears her name. Census rolls from her teenage years show her exactly where she was born, Fayette, Maine, listed as a pauper, living in other households, working without wage for shelter and bread. There is no romance in that, no seduction, only survival. The legend claims she gave birth to a secret child, a boy adopted in silence. But the only child ever recorded to Emeline was Gustavus Chamberlain, born in 1844, a year after her documented marriage to George Chamberlain, a widower who brought children of his own into their home. And Gustavus was never given away. He grew up with her, appears in every census, worked the land, married, raised children of his own. He was not a stranger returned. He was her son. Always. Then there's Leonard Gurney, the man she married in 1878, decades after George disappeared. The myth insists he was the child she had given up. But Leonard was born in 1804, 12 years before Emeline. When they married, she was 62. He was 74. That alone unravels the entire legend. Her supposed son would have had to be born when she was 2 years old. No court document supports the claim of an annulled marriage. No local paper mentions scandal. No church record records a rebuke. Not a single document, not even her death certificate, suggests shame. And yet shame is all that remains. Why? Because the facts of her life, the real ones, are quiet, painful, and unremarkable. A girl born into poverty. A woman abandoned by one husband, widowed by another, a mother who outlived her child. A life of endurance, not drama. But drama is easier to pass down than pain. A story where Emeline is the victim of fate, of a tragic incest she never saw coming, that lingers. It becomes a moral tale, a way to control, to warn, to punish. And so, the town buried her twice. First in the ground, then under a story too good to question. But the documents don't lie. She wasn't the mother of her husband. She wasn't a secret sinner. She was a woman the world forgot, until it remembered her all wrong. A century after her death, Emeline Gurney rose again, not from the grave, but from a book. In 1980, Judith Rosner released Emeline, a novel that borrowed its bones from the legend of Fayette. In Rosner's hands, the forgotten Maine pauper became Emeline Mosher, a tragic heroine sent to the mills of Lowell, seduced by a factory boss. Her child taken and erased. Her future shattered when that child returned, grown, and unknowingly became her husband. It was fiction, but it didn't feel like fiction. Rossner never claimed it was true. But she didn't have to. The bones were already buried in Maine soil, and they were just believable enough to haunt. Emeline became a bestseller. Reviewers called it a grave tale of lasting impact. It was compared to Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, American tragedy recast through Puritan eyes. Then came the music. In 1996, composer Tobias Picker turned Rossner's novel into an opera. On stage, Emeline's silence became aria. Her heartbreak, symphony. Emeline premiered at the Santa Fe Opera and later graced stages in New York and beyond, reimagined as an American retelling of the Oedipus myth, not from the son's perspective, but the mother's. The audience wept, not for the truth, but for the story. And somewhere in that transformation, from pauper to protagonist, from widow to symbol, Emeline Gurney was lost again, reburied beneath costume and spotlight, immortalized not for what she endured, but for what she never did. And still, the myth spread further. In 1989, PBS aired Sins of Our Mothers, a documentary built on the interview with Nettie Mitchell, the same woman whose childhood memory had given voice to the myth. Her story, dramatized and cut to music, became national broadcast. History blurred with hearsay. And America listened. They believed. Because by then, the truth no longer mattered. The legend had become real enough. Emeline wasn't just a woman from Maine anymore. She was an icon of sin and sorrow, performed for applause. Why do some lies last longer than the truth? Because a lie, well told, has a purpose. The myth of Emeline Gurney wasn't born to entertain. It was forged to warn. In a world where women's value was measured in silence and obedience, her story became a cautionary tale. A woman who broke the rules, even by accident, must suffer, must starve, must be condemned. That was the power of the tale. It didn't matter if she was guilty. It only mattered that she couldn't prove she wasn't. The legend gave Fayette a sinner to punish, a symbol of what happens when women step outside the circle drawn for them. It turned shame into spectacle. It turned moral panic into memory. And it turned Emeline into something she never was, monstrous. But the greatest tragedy isn't that the town believed the story. It's that the world wanted to. A poor woman, a small town, no voice, no grave. She was easy to erase and easier to rewrite. So the next time you hear a tale too awful to be true, ask what purpose it serves, who benefits, and who disappears beneath the weight of the telling. Because Emeline Gurney is not a myth. She was a woman, and they buried her twice. Some lives end with silence, others echo, twisted by fear, shaped by guilt, and passed on like family heirlooms. Emeline Gurney never told her story, but the world did, and in doing so it chose a lie more compelling than her truth. A mother, a widow, a woman erased, but not forgotten. Now, as her name is spoken once more, not as a fable, but as a life, may she rest finally in truth.